The Japanese were confident that their bunker system on Bougainville Island was flawless, completely invisible to any kind of reconnaissance, impervious to every attack. But when the US military brought a new, advanced flamethrower onto the battlefield, it forced the Japanese to redefine the very meaning of the word flawless. The mornings on Bougainville were always damp. At the edge of the canopy, a patch of ground looked like any other, alive with the rumble of insects, the whisper of wind, but the American soldiers knew that beneath it was not merely earth. It was a complex of wood, steel, tamped earth, and connecting tunnels. The enemy's hornet's nest sat right there, bunker upon bunker, defensive lines woven like a herringbone, every slit a gun muzzle, every trench an eye. Artillery had roared all night, yet when the smoke cleared the surface, lay silent as if untouched. From the air, the jungle swallowed every trace. No roof showed itself, only bottomless green. Reconnaissance teams had tried to push in. They went 10 feet, 15, a small snap, like someone breaking a dry twig. Then, almost immediately, a crossed web of fire erupted. Rounds hammered into tree trunks, tearing bark off, shredding the space between root and mud. A man who stepped forward would be ripped before he could even see his shooter. The problem revealed itself bare and ugly. To take this area, you needed something that could advance through a storm of bullets, withstand infantry fire, and deliver destruction into the darkest places. The winding tunnel stretches, the dry frog-mouth chambers, barely big enough for one person to crawl through. Bombs fell in the wrong places. Artillery couldn't punch through the reinforcements. Infantry couldn't live long enough to plant charges. All approaches were locked by the same key, hidden firing points and claustrophobic space. America was dragged into the fight, and on this forested front they found themselves behind in one haunting weapon, the flamethrower. But it didn't take long to catch up. In 1941, the M1 model was introduced. It could drive men out of bunkers, force the hidden to reveal themselves. Its structure was as simple as a mechanical formula. 2 fuel tanks slung on the back, a compressed nitrogen pressure tank and a nozzle with an ignition unit out front. In theory, the liquid flame could reach about 20 yards, a distance enough to make someone inside a bunker change his mind. But theory and reality were always far apart. In humidity and wind, the igniter misbehaved. Some days it winked once and died. Some days it refused to spark at all. Many operators stuffed a lighter into their shirt pocket like a talisman to relight it when the machine sulked. Low pressure, sputtering fuel flow, some units threw an intermittent streak, some didn't fire at all. Worst of all was leakage, fuel soaking into the canvas jacket, a stray spark turning the wearer's back into a torch. Before they even met enemy fire, the weapon itself could kill its owner. And, once you strapped on an M1, you suddenly stood half a head taller on the battlefield, more than 60 pounds on your shoulders, bulky, your back a drawn target. The enemy saw the shadow of the tanks before they saw your face. Flamethrower troops became priority targets. The only advantage was that when they got close, the flame could find gaps that bullets could not. It crawled through crevices, seized dry wood, slipped into the sweat and dust smell of a tunnel. But to get close, they had to walk through invisible scissors cutting the air. At command, maps were pinned with red markers. The debate was not whether to use fire, but how to bring fire without killing the men who carried it. January 30th, 1944. The rutted dirt road, roots sticking up, trembled under a line of tracks. 5 modified Stuarts lumbered to the forest edge, mud mottling their armour. Inside the turrets sat not only shells and guns, but something that had no shape like a bullet. Radio chatter mixed with insect noise. Keep distance, drive smoke first, aim straight at the tunnel entrance. The edge of the foliage opened into a dark patch. Ahead, the hornet's nest lay silent as if it did not exist. But everyone knew they were being watched by gun barrels hidden beneath the ground. The clock hand inched forward one tick. The final order snapped out, brief. Their weapon was not bullets nor artillery. If the fire could find every crack, what about the man who carried the fire? The question at the end of that morning hadn't even faded into the hum of insects before it found its answer. Put the fire inside steel. Not in a research lab lit through the night, but in a makeshift repair shop clinging to the shoreline of New Caledonia. Here, in the late summer of 1943, an officer of the 754th Tank Battalion looked at the scorched backs of flamethrower men, listened to their lungs rasp after every test, and said, "Mount it on a tank." The name of the man who voiced the idea was rarely written down. Some sources credit Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, but the way the idea appeared was clear. It sprang from a very specific lack. Infantry couldn't follow the flame because flame demanded they stand bare in a rain of bullets. So let the Stuart M1A1 be the shielded back. Steel would take the rounds, the engine would close the distance, the turret would carry fire to the bunker's mouth. Crude, yes, but it made sense. Then the idea hit reality. Anyone who had ever crawled inside a Stuart knew how suffocatingly cramped it was. 2 men in the turret knocked their heads together as it was. Now add a flamethrower with tanks and piping. It sounded like a bad joke. Every time they opened a panel, mechanics bumped into a cluster of cables, an ammo rack, a crossbeam. "Where do we put the tanks?" The question repeated until voices were hoarse. The answer was hammered together with bolts and hacksaws. In Noumea, they shortened the M1A1's barrel, bent the piping so it would fit alongside the 30 caliber bow machine gun. 2 5-gallon gas cans were crammed in, one under the gunner's seat, the other in place of an ammo box. The thin steel hull of the Stuart clanged as holes were drilled for mounting brackets. The fuel line ran like a new vein grafted into an old body. When the switch was thrown for a test, compressed nitrogen hissed faintly from the tank, a sign of pressure, then went silent. The whole crew held its breath. Another problem: ignition. In the jungle, wind and humidity made every spark temperamental. The electric igniter sometimes flickered out like a dying bulb. Mechanics reached into the narrow space between armour and gun, adjusted wires, tested every connection. The driver quietly pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicked it once, snap, to remind himself what real flame looked like. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. If ignition wasn't reliable, the whole machine was nothing but a tracked gasoline can. And then came the crew's living space. 1 nitrogen cylinder, 2 gas cans, hoses snaking everywhere. The turret felt like an overstuffed box. The driver tried nudging the controls. The flamethrower's stock brushed lightly against the gunner's shoulder, then slid aside. Okay. But when the gunner swung the weapon to line up with the pistol port, he had to hold his breath short to avoid touching the edge of hot metal. Every move had to be relearned: how to rotate the turret, how to keep the throttle steady, how to keep rhythm with the infantry following behind. By October, the modified model was rolled out for a field test by the runway. On the uneven grass, a row of folding chairs was set up for American, Australian and New Zealand officers. The Stuart's engine coughed to life, crawled toward a mock bunker built of wet wood. A brief order crackled over the radio. The flamethrower barrel dipped. A hiss. Then a streak of golden flame bit into the wooden surface, crawled into the seams. The stench of burning spread fast, heavy smoke veiling faces. Eyes lit up behind safety goggles. Brows furrowed when the pressure gauge dropped faster than expected. Engineers flipped notebooks open, scribbled another line of notes. Time was running short, because November 1st was the Bougainville landing. When American tracks carved into the shore, the flame tank was still not ready. On the ships, some turrets were still wide open, pipes still needed tightening, fittings still had to be secured. Infantry stepped onto wet sand without the fiery escort the plan had promised. The bunkers out there were waiting. It wasn't until January 1944, when the US pushed its beachhead deeper, that the machine finally saw battle. Not as some pristine invention born from a laboratory, but as a patchwork solution built with bolts, grease, and the reckless ingenuity of mechanics and tank crews. The 754th in the Pacific since early 1942, and now under Major Reino Latinum, brought its forward detachment onto the island, Stuart tanks that carried not only shells but fire. Yesterday afternoon ended in the smell of engine oil and blotched blueprints. This morning began with a map stretched over a wooden crate. Red pins traced a curve along the shore of Empress Augusta Bay. They connected blind spots where the jungle knitted tight, stretching from the east bank of the Torokina River to the village of Mavavia. On paper, it was a string of dots. Under the canopy, it was a web of wooden bunkers reinforced with timbers, the stronghold of the 2nd Battalion, 4th South Seas Brigade. Every axis of attack seemed to funnel into a narrow throat. The 132nd Regiment had tried to push, then stalled amid criss-crossed streaks of fire. The ground underfoot was soggy, the air heavy and viscous. Every opening in the jungle could be a gun muzzle. They knew the enemy conserved ammunition, but did not miss at range. Whenever a soldier's silhouette slipped past a tree trunk, the trigger would immediately draw a horizontal line of fire across the chest. Tunnels linked to tunnels. Crawls led to hide shelters. Anyone who stepped out of cover became a distinct shape on an invisible target. On the forest edge, the Stuart M1A1's engine muttered and coiled, sounding nothing like the isolated shots coming from the other side. American steel carried radios, optics, steady fire, things that did not shout but that changed the tempo of the battlefield. From the opposite brush, Japanese rifles and light machine guns let loose low volleys, relying on camouflage and position. On one side was the craft of concealment that the jungle perfected. On the other was the will to bend distance with machinery and coordination. The two were about to meet on a patch of mud. The quick briefing ended with an uncompromising decision. General John Hodge named the unit to go into action. The 754th Battalion. Among the M1A1s in today's lineup were several fitted with flamethrowers. The next 2 hours were spent stitching the tempo of the attack together, like assembling a machine. Smoke to blind the eye, 81mm mortars and artillery to pound the hard points, tanks to open the way, infantry to close in, the demolition team to finish the job. Every link had to mesh. One small slip could throw the whole formation into the blades of those unseen firing points. 7:45 a.m. The muffled thump of the 82nd Chemical Mortar Battalion laid smoke across the canopy. The white-grey roll poured into the trail like hoarfrost. Smoke killed no one, but it stole the sight of those inside the bunkers. Behind that curtain, the staccato thuds of 81mm mortars struck wood, making the jungle tremble as if someone had given it a hard yank. Artillery joined the score with long roars, striking suspected emplacements. The earth shook violently. 8:30 a.m. Company C of the 132nd formed up immediately behind the tanks. They did not ride too close to avoid the tracks, but they could not fall too far back. The demolition team needed that precise instant to surge forward, plant charges, and finish what the turrets had opened. Everyone knew the script. Few were certain it would play out to the line. The wind shifted. Smoke rolled aside, bringing the smell of wet earth and scorching wood. In the grey-white haze, the human eye saw only shadows and shapes. Any twig that trembled oddly could be a sign. A soldier froze when he noticed a low, dark slit. His hand gently tapped the sleeve in front of him, the prearranged signal. Inside the turret, the gunner's gaze pinned to the observation slit. Every dark spot in the smoke could be a bunker mouth. He ran the sequence in his head: open the valve, check the pressure, wait for the command. The driver kept the engine revs flat like an electrical current, ready to press forward on a moment's notice. In the rear, the demolition team pressed a hand to the chest pouch, holding their detonator, counting the beat with a thumb. The final order went over the radio in a phrase so short it was almost a breath. The tanks began to crawl their tracks into the damp stand of trees. Metal scraping earth rang out sharp and cold, like a blade cutting a curtain. C-132nd soldiers crouched low along the flank of the vehicles, boots sinking in mud to the ankles. The smoke ahead thickened. Everything was in place. The point of no return stood up before them, invisible as a thin thread. One more step and the hornet's nest would awaken. The tracks had just chewed over a ridge of roots when the smoke screen ahead shivered like a sheet yanked tight. Then came the blast from behind, not the familiar rhythm of 81mm mortars or preparatory artillery, but a short, dry crack, far too close. Tragedy struck at the very moment the battle with the enemy had barely begun. The shock wave slammed against the steel hull, every chest inside pressed down as though by an unseen hand. Smoke snapped backward. Just past 9 a.m., an errant artillery shell struck the lead Stuart. Flames leapt instantly from the tank's flank, clinging to its thin armour, licking along the edges like an animal sniffing for fat. Sergeant Minor J. Hall, the gruff crew leader who was always curt during checks, had only a second to collapse into the searing heat. The other two crewmen were hurled from their seats, cries swallowed in the stench of smoke and burning rubber. Corporal Joe Simon was flung out through the hatch, body smacking into the mud, then stood as if his limbs already knew the way back, turning toward the burning tank, stepping into gunfire to drag his comrades out. Bullets cut through the haze. He fell just short of the flames, never to rise again. Later, his name would be written alongside the Silver Star. But in that moment, there was only mud, fire, and silence heavy as lead. It was a terrible loss for the Americans, yet they had to push forward, forbidden to grieve or assign blame, because ahead the enemy still waited. The firing from across the line rose sharply. Hidden muzzles inside the bunkers responded as a single body, crossfire biting into tree trunks, slicing across helmet rims. The line between life and death was as thin as the film of mud clinging to a canvas jacket. A misstep meant stepping into an invisible killing ground. One long breath could be slower than the speed of a bullet. In the low brush, Sergeant Second Class. Jesse Drowley of Company B saw men go down before he even heard the cries. He leapt from cover when instinct told everyone else to press closer to the ground. A simple gesture, his left hand grabbing the collar of a staggering soldier, his right pulling the wounded man clear of the creeping fire line. Rounds gnawed the earth's edge in front of his boots, mud spat up like hail. Drowley didn't stop. He dragged another man into cover, pressed his hand against the wound to staunch the bleeding, then dashed back out again. Everything happened in sharp bursts. Crawl, pull, press, breathe, crawl. Silent motions woven into a lifeline that kept the formation from breaking apart under the storm of fire. Up ahead, the remaining flame tank ground close to the bunker line. Its steel shielded the unit as they repositioned after the mistaken strike. The liquid flame hissed, gun muzzle lowering like a head bent to seek a door. Its effect showed immediately. Each time that streak of fire licked into a slit, gunfire cut short, smoke and screams churned together, then faded. Bunkers that had defied penetrating rounds collapsed one after another as fire crept into corners. The once seamless web of crossfire began to retract its claws. The contrast sharpened against the grey backdrop. On one side, pressure gauges, radios, engines holding steady revolutions. On the other, Molotovs, trenches, probing rounds fired from the dark. The Japanese were masters of concealment. They fought with position and jungle habit. The Americans pushed with machinery and coordination. Two ways of thinking stretched taut against each other on the same muddy trail. Smoke from the struck Stuart mingled with the screen, thick enough to leave a bitter taste at the back of the tongue. One soldier counted silently to time his dash across an open patch. Another touched the pouch at his chest where the detonator lay, a gesture of reassurance. A burst of fire swept low, shredding the pack strap off the shoulder of a man who had just escaped death. Drowley shoved him down, pressed him into a shallow ditch, then lifted his head once more. He knew that if that gun nest stayed alive, every step of the formation would be paid in blood. And he also knew he could not wait forever for a clear order in a battlefield shifting by the second. Inside the turret, the radio rasped hoarse through smoke. "Hold distance, lower angle, prepare to fire." Pressure hissed up in a high note, then throttled back like someone seizing the throat of a beast. Steel heated enough for gloved hands to feel it. The crew waited for one thing only: the signal from the man who had eyes on that hidden gun. The tempo of battle dipped to match the pause between two breaths. The flame tank reloaded for another burst. Infantry curled tight under root cover. Drowley leaned half his body against the hot steel, eyes locked on the dark slit he believed was the gun's mouth. The crew needed a clearer mark. They needed light to guide them through the dense smoke. Inside the turret, the gauge needle edged to a new line. Sweat soaked through gloves, making the control grip slippery. The engine's hum was taut as a stretched wire. Everyone waited for the same thing: fire to touch the bunker's mouth, to flare at the right second. The fire had touched the bunker's mouth, but would it ignite? The hiss inside the steel belly stretched half a beat longer. The hiss of pressure inside the turret stretched on, then dropped as if a wire had been snapped. The nozzle dipped close to the bunker's mouth. Fuel spewed out, a heavy, glistening stream, landing squarely in the open slit that had pinned down the American infantry out front. Everyone waited for the spark to catch. Nothing. Only the wind scraping across the armour's edge, brushing against the damp surface. The ignition had failed. A minor fault in a technical manual, but here it was the gap between life and death. The stream of fuel coated the wooden ledge, trickled into the tunnel, pooling into a dark puddle. If the enemy managed to toss out a fire bottle, the whole machine would become kindling. The infantry behind hesitated for a beat. You couldn't charge a bunker soaked in gasoline without flame. Inside the cramped turret, the operator clenched his jaw. He glanced at the pressure gauge, at the dead switch sitting like a stone. No time to argue with machinery. Outside, bullets probed toward the turret along cold, straight lines. One struck the armor plate, booming inside the hull like a hammer. He popped the hatch. Heat blasted his face, carrying the stench of scorched wood and damp canvas. Gunfire slapped white streaks across the armour's edge, fanning just above his shoulder. His hand pulled the pin on an aluminum thermite grenade. No manual told him to do this, but that was the American way, always carrying a fix for when the machine refused to talk. He rose halfway out of the hatch and hurled the thermite straight into the line of fuel. The throw was short, but felt like a slope too long. Everyone held their breath at once. The crew froze. The infantry locked eyes on the bunker's mouth. The enemy gunner paused on his trigger. A round tore across the hatch rim, flaking metal like scales. A flash. A white streak flared, then roared into a cone of fire. The thermite bit into the fuel like meat to a starving beast. In one shudder of earth, flame gripped the wooden ledges, hissed into the tunnel, snaked through its dark seams. Gunfire ceased for a moment, only the sound of fire chewing into wet wood and hot gases blasting back through the doorway like the breath of a massive chest. The unit behind rose halfway from cover. One soldier pressed a mud-stained hand to the shoulder ahead, counting silently to 3. No need to shout. The bunker that had pinned their formation all morning went dark like a lamp unplugged. Its gun muzzles swallowed, its screams breaking, then gone. "Target cleared," rasped the radio voice, sharp as a needle. The crew pulled the hatch shut. The operator exhaled, smoke mingling with the scent of heated leather gloves. Just then, a burst of rounds slashed through the brush on the right, hissing low across the ground like a knife. No time to celebrate. The flame was lit, but the battlefield had not relented. The infantry pressed tight against the tank's flank, bracing for the next step. More bunkers still waited, more breathing holes to be sealed. In the jungle's heart, the wind shifted, dragging smoke back across the formation. Eyes watered from the heat, but fingers still tapped the detonator caps in perfect rhythm. The line between life and death thinned again. One slip of the hand, one fire bottle at the wrong moment, and the spearhead would shatter. Inside the turret, the pressure needle lifted once more. The system was ready for another burst. Hold formation. Advance slow. The radio voice spared no extra words. The M1A1 crawled forward half a track, its barrel lowering inch by inch. On the blackened wood ahead, fire still gnawed deeper, and just as the flames stabilized, another sound cut through the smoke, not wood cracking, not rounds slamming steel. It was like a signal, pulsing, metallic, echoing from deep in the jungle. A steady rhythm, struck like a command against timber. Faces lifted all at once, brows furrowed before words could form. A scout on the flank whipped his head, straining to find its source. The radio hissed an extra burst, as if the line had been pulled too tight. And just as the fire roared, the sound grew clearer, faster, repeating. It was calling someone on the other side, telling them the moment had come. There was no warning beyond the shifting wind and the unnatural shiver of tree shadows. Then, without prelude, enemy fire arced low. A Molotov cocktail burst into an orange flare against the armour, sliding down like a shooting star falling into a dark valley. 10:30 a.m. At that same instant, mortar shells thudded down in a hurried chain. Earth spat upward like brown hail. Explosions drowned out the engines. Shockwaves slammed mud against the tank tracks. A few fire bottles smashed across the turrets, flames licking steel before sputtering out against armour slicked by rain. But not every tank was spared by chance. One crew was hit just as their hatch was cracked open. Second Lieutenant John White never rose again. Elsewhere, Sergeant James Jarman slumped after a shell burst at his feet. Their names vanished into the smoke, into the stench of burning fuel, rubber and mud, leaving only the practiced motions of the living, slamming hatches, smothering fire, shifting positions. The contrast was stark. American steel could block frontal blows, steady fire, maintain communication through radios. But the enemy's fire bottles found the soft seams, leaning on jungle shadows, striking at the worst moments of visibility. Machinery met jungle instinct, procedure met the precision of a faceless throw. On damp ground, both were equally deadly. The order came over the radio, short and hoarse, lower profile. The M1A1 backed half a track, turret angling aside. The driver opened space for the infantry. The infantry pressed in to pull the crew clear. Everyone paused for half a beat, not from fear, but to see the thing trying to kill them. Smoke from Molotovs twisted upward. Mortars beat a rhythm steady as a hot clock. The forest scattered patches of light across faces, making every movement seem half slow, half fast. An engineer crawled through a drainage ditch, yanked the cap off a sand canister, poured it over flames clinging to a track. Another whipped a soaked tarp across, dragging the fire off the hull, drawing a long breath as if stealing air from the ground itself. Inside the turret, the pressure gauge held steady, ready, but the flamethrower stayed silent. You did not fire without seeing the bunker's mouth. That was the only discipline amid chaos. Japanese fire stitched low across the ground, the way of men used to shooting from dugouts. A machine gun somewhere shredded the gap between two trunks, each burst snapping like fingers on a metronome. Leaves shattered into powder, sprinkling American shoulders like green chalk dust. Armour shrugged off makeshift fire, but flesh outside that armour was as thin as a wet page. Midline, a flame tank swung left to cover a trapped squad's retreat. Coordination clicked back in. Tank pressure forced gun points to show, infantry shifted forward, engineers set charges in place. In the radios, industrial vocabulary, coordinates, distances, angles, collided with the ragged breathing of battle. Across the tree line, the enemy wielded only two tools, mortars and fire bottles. But timed just right, they bit into the smooth rhythm of machines, stalling the advance like sand in a gear. A gap opened in the smoke, enough to glimpse the dark slit where the machine gun had flared. The gunner swung the turret, the driver held engine revs flat as a ruler's edge. But the haze rolled back in, swallowing the sign. To fire now would be to waste flame into the jungle, leaving only their own mark, a fire without a target, a perfect aim point for mortars. They held one beat longer. Radio chatter dropped for a few seconds, then returned like static waves. A clipped call-out marked an opening on the right flank. A blunt warning passed of a fire bottle being handed along a trench. A stretcher wove between two trunks, snaking rearward. The medic bent just low enough to keep his helmet from the waist-high crossfire. On the stretcher, the boots lay stiff as logs. No one had time to check the name stitched on the chest patch. The counterattack had earned its purpose, slowing the advance, igniting loss, grinding the American line lower into the dirt. But it also created a new demand. The hidden gun nests had to be seen, had to be marked with certainty for the turret. Without that, industrial might was only a blindfolded machine. A strange break crept into the sound of gunfire. The machine gun's bursts were too steady, almost careless, a sign of someone confident in their cover. That position was ripping the path open. Blind volleys only stripped more leaves from the jungle. The turret waited for something other than smoke and sound, a spark bright enough to guide the flame straight in. The spearhead stood on a knife's edge, mortars still thudded sporadically. Smoke drifted into thin walls, enough to cover, enough to blind. At the edge of one such wall, Jesse Drowley rose halfway, eyes fixed on the dark slit where the machine gun chattered with the confidence of security. Low rounds tore across the ground. Each burst flung mud upward. Each burst carved another piece off the path of survival. He dashed across the gap, choosing the instant when the gun paused to reload. Mud splashed across his face, stinging hot with embers from burnt fragments. The steel hull of the nearest flame tank radiated heat. Drowley pressed against it as though it were a wall that could move with him. His hand rapped the turret stock. 3 urgent knocks. Inside, the crew swung the barrel to his hand signals. Right, left, lower. Flame burst out, chewing into wet foliage, scouring the suspected spot, but missing the bunker's mouth. Smoke thickened, erasing what had been gained. The machine gun replied with a harsh volley, shredding the earth's edge beneath Drowley's knees. American steel had eyes through its sights, ears through its radios, power to hold its engine steady as a ruled line. But in damp smoke, the machine still lacked one thing, a marker the human eye could read in an instant. The Japanese needed little. Interlocked bunkers, low fire lanes, and a shadowed hole deep enough to hide a machine gun. 2 worlds pressed against each other on the same rotting log. Drowley climbed onto the tank's roof. Bullets sliced through the canopy, green fragments raining onto armour. He sat braced halfway upright, left hand pointing again. Inside, the gunner answered with an invisible nod. The turret turned. But the smoke rolled back in, swallowing the sliver of light. One more blind burst would be wasted. Drowley paused half a beat, like a craftsman steadying a chisel before the decisive strike. He yanked up his submachine gun, swapped in a tracer magazine. His mud-smeared hand flicked the safety off, eyes squinting through the milky haze. Here. A thin fire streak leapt out, cutting a straight line through the smoke. Small, sharp, precise, repeated. The streak struck the tree's base, slipped into a shadowed hole. 3 more lines drove into the same point. The turret followed those needle-thin paths like a seamstress's hand following thread. The machine gun snapped back as reflex. A round tore across Drowley's chest, hot metal searing flesh. He shook his head to force the world into one straight line. No time to count wounds. No room to collapse. 3 more tracers. His hands trembled, but the streaks stayed true. Inside, the gunner held his breath, finger pressing tight on the grip. The driver anchored the tank in mud deep enough to absorb recoil without slipping. The order came sharp as a blade. "Target by tracer!" The flame roared, this time straight into the place the light had marked. A guttural bellow rose from beneath the earth like an animal slamming its cage. Fire surged into the hole, whipping smoke and heat backward, swallowing the gun that had ripped the formation all morning. The moment was so brief, no one had time to cheer. Drowley held his stance, vision blurred by blood and smoke, still laying 2 final tracer lines, seals across the door, just closed. Then he slid down, the armour, back against steel, hand pressed to his wet chest. Beneath, infantry crawled forward to seize the spot, engineers laying their charges, closing the work of fire. A medic scrambled over the roots, reaching to drag Drowley down behind the tank. He brushed the hand aside, shook his head, a short, final gesture. Not yet. He turned back once more, checking the darkness that had vanished, making sure the nest was truly silent. Gunfire slackened into scattered cracks, yielding to the unfinished roar of fire chewing damp wood. The radio spoke calm and flat. Target neutralized. No shouts, only breath finding its way back into lungs. Drowley rose slowly, one hand braced on the armour's edge, eyes narrowing as though peering through a window caked with dirt. The world now was only fragments of colour, grey smoke, blackened timber, green forest, and red haze at the corners of vision. He nodded to the crew, a brief thank you, then turned to the medic, signalling, "Now." As the stretcher lifted, a fire bottle burst late in the distance, a final curse flung by the other side. Instinctively, heads ducked, then rose in unison. The formation had climbed the sheer ridge. Where the gun nest of shadow had been, there was only a blackened scar and heat spilling out. Later, people would speak of the Medal of Honor. One day, a president would place it in his hands. But in this moment, the only reward was a few more inches of breathing room for his comrades, a straight path for the flame the next time. America had its machines, its armour, its fire, its tracers, pieces of a superior system. But the American, today named Jesse Drowley, was the lock that made the system click shut at the right instant. The ambulance slid between 2 trees, carrying him to the rear. Infantry filled the gap. The turret turned slowly, probing for other dark slits. Somewhere in the jungle, the storm of bullets still churned. But now a thread of light stretched across the smoke, and the formation moved with it. As the stretcher carrying Drowley disappeared behind 2 trees, the gunfire eased just enough for the crew to hear the turret's machine breathing. The flamethrower had sealed the bunker's mouth, but the system itself had also reached its limit. Pressure had dropped, valves overheated, the pipes needed to rest. Early in the afternoon, a short order crackled over the radio. Pull back to refuel and recharge pressure. It was the practical rhythm every battle had, but few ever saw. Each burst gave the flame only about 20 seconds of life. 20 counts inside a cramped hull, 20 streaks of fire that could erase a fortification, yet also drain the pressure gauge. The supply line stretched backward into the jungle like a living artery. Gas cans passed hand to hand, nitrogen tanks swapped, fittings tightened by mechanics who knew the smell of hot threads. On the other side, the enemy dug deeper into their bunkers, patient as the dark itself. In a clearing sheltered from the wind, the crew opened the hatches. the air filled with the weightless but crushing mix of hot metal, raw gas, oil and sweat. A mechanic replaced a gasket, the driver wiped down his sights, the gunner scanned the dials one last time. No one spoke about the morning. They talked about dropping the barrel 1 more degree, splitting the fire into 2 shorter bursts, pausing between them to hold pressure. American steel lived by numbers. Their own survival lived by knowing what those numbers looked like in reality. Behind them, the supply team filled in the gaps of machinery. Gas cans lined in rows, cylinders marked for pressure, rubber hammers tapping lightly against pipes to test for hollows, a kind of mechanic's hearing. Industry wasn't only in factories. It appeared here in the way a tank remade itself in damp jungle, in the order that rose out of chaos. The forest was quiet, as if hiding a thought. Many sensed the next push would come soon, but before that they had to give fire back its breath. The commander glanced at his watch and nodded. The minute hand struck the mark. 1:30 p.m, 5 M3A1s rolled out of the clearing one by one, sealing hatches, locking clamps. The radios were clear of static. The route was familiar now. Tree roots, mud holes, low-hanging smoke. At the forest's edge, scattered gunfire sounded like someone yawning when roused from sleep. The steel spearhead returned, no longer charging recklessly as in the morning. The formation moved with the calm of men who had found the right door. Smoke rolled first. Mortars pounded hardpoints, armour closed in, infantry followed. Once again, contrast stretched across the line. The enemy hidden in timber, firing low, waiting with fire bottles. The Americans driven by machine discipline, crisp frequency tables, practiced motions repeated. If the morning had been the search for a solution, the afternoon was writing the answer onto the earth. One flame tank cracked open a bunker mouth with a short burst, keeping pressure within safe limits. Infantry slid into the gap, pressed against logs, tossed in small satchel charges. Engineers sealed the mouth with a sharp detonation. On the flank, another tank lowered its barrel to the newly corrected angle, sweeping a shallow streak of fire to clear obstacles, careful not to leave a flame long enough to invite mortar fire. Everything clicked like machinery, yet softened the moment it touched human hands. At times, the line paused simply because someone heard the hiss of an air vent beneath the soil. An American pressed his ear to the mud, listening to the hot breath of the bunker, then signalled the turret to shift half a tread. 1 short burst was enough. Fire slid into the slit, forced hot air up until the ground trembled faintly. When smoke swallowed the opening, infantry slipped in, hands pressing on damp wood still warm to the touch. American steel opened the door, American hands locked it shut. Sometimes the line between life and death was only half a second. A mortar falling half a second late would just be dust behind them. Half a second early, it could tear the formation apart. A fire bottle an inch off would skid across armour. Dead on, it would stick to a latch. The edge lay in controlling rhythm, forcing the enemy to fire on their terms, driving each hidden point to reveal itself at the exact instant the flame passed through. On the radios, words shifted from orders to confirmations. Open, open. In, inside. Locked, locked. Industrial language became background music. The setting was jungle, the players steel and men. Japanese machine guns snapped from the tree line now and then, but each time a precise jet of flame cut them off mid-bite. An engineer counted silently as he lit the fuse. 3, 2, 1. The blast was sharp as a snapped finger. The bunker mouth collapsed, leaving the smell of fresh soil. The flame tank swung to the next target while pressure still held. Not a drop wasted. One by one, the knots unravelled. No spectacle, only a path cleared by the steady insistence of routine. The sun softened above the canopy, but the jungle's core still burned hot. All eyes turned toward the deeper line, where the bunkers still overlapped. The final order rang out like a hand striking a drum. Keep the rhythm of coordination. Flame tank opens, infantry strikes, engineers finish. A cycle, repeated, precise, gathering strength. The formation pressed forward. The fire had its breath again. The machine carried the human rhythm. The forest stood still, waiting for each door to be knocked in turn. The order crackled over the radio like a plucked string. Open, assault, finish. Steel and men slid closer, the rhythm of the machine matching the rhythm of breath. At the edge of the smoke, the dark slits were knocked on one by one. The flame tank pressed its barrel down, fired a short burst, infantry crawled in, demolition teams sealed the lock. That machine of coordination advanced like a loom, weaving threads of fire into each knot of the bunker net. By the time the ground stopped trembling from charges, the numbers emerged from the smoke, sharp as print. 28 bunkers burned out or breached. Of those, 14 were credited directly to the flame tanks. The rest collapsed in the chain reaction of flame, bullets, mortars and handheld flamethrowers pushed against bunker mouths. No one raised a hand to savour victory. They simply counted again, striking X's across the wooden map board. Each mark another heartbeat eased. The contrast that had stretched from the first hour of battle now balanced out on the ground. On the Japanese side, reinforced logs, tunnels, fire bottles, low-angled firing points, a harsh geometry of defence. On the American side, armour, compressed pressure, controlled flame bursts, radios, synchronised rhythm, a geometry of attack measured in process and discipline. When those two geometries overlapped, the margin was razor-thin, a correct barrel angle, a burst of just the right length, a crawl at the right second. Miss the beat, men died. Hit the beat, bunkers fell. The smaller spearheads joined into a wide front. In one stretch of jungle, a flame tank touched the mouth of a bunker exposed by a flaw in camouflage. The flame swallowed the hot breath spilling from a vent pipe. In another, infantry read the hollow sound beneath their boots, proof of an underground chamber, then signalled the turret to shift half a tread. Every movement carried a pause to wait for the next, flame pausing for men, men pausing for flame. In that process, 28 rounds of pause, move, became 28 locked doors. But war was never just numbers. Between the X's on the map lay silences. The smell of burnt canvas mixed with wet earth, a steel helmet lying upside down beside a mudprint, a bunker mouth, breathing only smoke. The line between life and death remained as thin as when the first tread struck a root, just thick enough for the living to cross without breaking. When the last squads pulled back from the jungle's edge, the map was lifted from its wooden frame and folded along its old creases. The day's impact wasn't held in numbers alone, it was in how those numbers had been made. The flame tank was no longer an improvised machine with a pipe bolted on. It now stood in its rightful place in the order of battle, opening doors with fire and steel, leading infantry in at the right moment, covering engineers as they finished the job. Hornet's Nest, once a name that defied them, had become the proving ground where the exam was graded in short, precise bursts of flame, and in the eyes of men who read terrain as clearly as print. The tactical result was plain. Enemy firepower broken, approach routes opened, the northern flank of the beachhead cleared of impassable points. But the greater impact was the shift in thinking. From this day forward, the Americans had a combat-tested solution to the problem of tropical bunkers, fire and steel advancing together side by side. No more sending men alone with flamethrower packs under webs of gunfire. The system was now tank, man, flame, bullet in rhythm. A rhythm that could be measured, taught and repeated. The horizon drew a red streak behind the tree line, and from that quiet edge a door opened far beyond the day's battlefield. The mechanics who had tightened bolts in New Caledonia would not stop at modified M1A1s. By mid-1944, dedicated flame tanks, machines called Satan, would enter the fight just in time for the coral and rock of Saipan and Guam. What had been born from improvisation at Bougainville would become doctrine. Bring flame into the bunkers, bring steel to the door, bring men in at the exact beat. Before leaving the jungle, one soldier stopped and looked back at the hornet's nest. Now it was only a line of black mouths, closed like shut eyes. He said nothing. He didn't need to. 28 and 14 were enough. They weren't boasts, they were milestones on a widening road, a road where fire was no longer one man's weapon, but the rhythm of an entire formation. The radios closed with a clipped phrase, "Area secure." Shadows stretched long under the canopy. Engines throttled down. Then everything sank into a thick silence, the kind that comes only after an equation has been solved. The folded map still carried streaks of mud along its creases. The jungle settled like a room after a violent symphony. In that silence, something had shifted, not the colour of the soil, but the line between the old way of fighting and the new. On the tropical battlefield, where timber and packed earth had once shrugged off shells and bombs, the partnership of flame tank and infantry had claimed its place. Steel to open the door, fire to clear the way, men to lock it shut. It was not a passing display. It was the order of a new rhythm. That rhythm hadn't been born in a planning room. It came from battlefield need, from a bunker that refused to die even after shellfire, to improvisation on a faraway island. Mechanics cutting down barrels, bending pipes, wedging gas cans beneath seats, feeding flame hoses through the old machine gun ports of M1A1 Stuarts. From that rough contraption, the formation learned how to speak its language. Radio calls shortened, gunners memorized their depression angles, drivers matched engine revs to cadence, engineers gauged demolition charges by eye. Short bursts of flame, pauses at the right moment, men moving in just as the fire pulled back. Layer by layer, it built into true coordination. Once the rhythm was clear, American industry carried it the rest of the way. Purpose-built flame tanks rolled out of the factory, carrying solutions first invented in field workshops. The name Satan was not to frighten, but the way a mechanic names a tool that simply works. From Bougainville, the rhythm carried forward to the sands of Saipan and Guam, where bunkers and caves came stacked in layers. The doctrine was no longer on paper. It rolled on tracks, breathed in pressure, and spoke with short, precise tongues of flame. The contrast, the backbone of the whole campaign, etched itself into history in its own way. The Japanese mastered shadowed jungle, tunnels, fire bottles, the habit of firing low from dark slits. The Americans mastered the voice of the machine, the rhythm of organization, the ability to turn small inventions into system strength. One side hid and waited for chances, the other forced chances into being. On the horizon's edge, the two methods collided. The line was thin as a leaf's edge, but it tipped toward those who rewrote the battlefield's rhythm. Some things never changed. The line between life and death stayed thin. The choke of smoke and gasoline still clawed the throat. Bullets still scraped armor like fingernails on iron doors. But now those elements were part of a score the Americans could read. When flame ran out, they fed it like breath into an instrument. When smoke thickened, they cut light through it. When one bunker sealed, they shifted a cog in the cycle to open another. Intelligence and organization, once invisible, had become weapons visible right at the front. At day's end, a crew stood beside their steward, its edges blackened with soot. They didn't speak of glory. They spoke of the angle that worked best, of pauses that should be shortened, of the jungle track they would run again tomorrow. Elsewhere, engineers marked off sealed bunker mouths. From repeated motions and scrawled notes, standardization took shape. Who did what, when, after whom, before whom, a language of coordination. And then, as the map was slipped into a pocket, memory pulled back to the morning of January 30th, 1944. The dirt road knotted with roots, 5 Stuarts lumbering toward the jungle's edge. Back then, their true weapon wasn't shells or guns. Back then, A question hung in the air. If fire could find every crevice, what about the man who carried the fire? The answer now stood clear. Put the man with the fire inside the steel, place the steel at the exact moment, set human rhythm into the machine's turning cycle. From that moment on, flame did more than burn out bunkers. It forged a doctrine,